Ask Mr. Sal. This episode is about the Vietnam conflict. Part 3 of the review covers Richard Nixon and the transition period to President Ford. Okay, we're picking up Part 3 of Ask Mr. Sal about the Vietnam War. We're going to discuss the Nixon and Ford years. So we have our overview. As we jump through, we covered the early years, we covered Kennedy, we covered LBJ, we're getting into Nixon. So Nixon wins the election of 1968. Remember, LBJ was not going to run. So Nixon wins the election. He's a hardcore anti-communist. He was vice president under Eisenhower. He campaigned in the 60s as an anti-communist. He got into debates with Nikita Khrushchev back in the day, back in the 50s. And he has this aura of being a hardcore anti-communist, which is going to come into play. He is elected as president. His goal was to end the war within 1 year. Takes office in 1969. By 1970, he wanted to be out of Vietnam. So they start drawing down troops. Takes us to the troop withdrawal. Now, to do that, if you're fighting a war, you have to come up with a way to not lose. So, let me grab this. I'm going to grab the pen here. So that's where we get the term Vietnamization. These two terms, troop withdrawal and Vietnamization, are tied together. Vietnamization was the concept of training the South Vietnamese army and troops to be able to combat the war and fight without Americans there. Because remember, the Americans have taken over a good part of the fighting. And Nixon wanted to pull those troops out. So to pull those troops out, you need a strong military left back. And this is where Vietnamization comes in. Pardon me as I sip my coffee outside on a beautiful morning. So Vietnamization is training the South Vietnamese army to take over the war and fight the invaders from North Vietnam and the rebel troops from South Vietnam. And this is all tied in with the goal to end the war within 1 year. Now, it's not as easy as that, and we're going to get into that in a second. So I'm going to pause this and we're talking about the Ho Chi Minh Trail, because that was one of the questions that popped up, and the Ho Chi Minh Trail is going to lead to a lot of other issues that are coming up and are going to cause problems for Nixon as we move forward. So I'm going to pause this and get right to that information in that infographic. So this is from the U.S. History website. Little video on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We're going to pull up the map here. And jump in with the whiteboard. Here's the DMZ, a demilitarized zone between North and South Vietnam. The trail, because North Vietnam and South Vietnam are fighting, the United States is allowed to attack into North Vietnam, as are South Vietnamese forces. The North Vietnamese run a series of trails and waterways, paths through the jungle that go through Laos and Cambodia. And then you have other trails that dropped into Cambodia that to get around the DMZ area. Which makes sense. You know, if you're being bombed and you're trying to transport troops and weapons from your country into where you're attacking, you go secretly. That's from the North Vietnamese standpoint. So they're running these trails and trying to get troops in clandestinely, secretly, without getting bombed. The Americans and South Vietnamese, on the converse side, flip side, if you're being attacked from areas and your enemy's being supplied from areas that are outside of where you're allowed to attack, you're going to secretly attack them because that's killing your people. So this leads to issues with Nixon because he's doing a lot of this secretly. He gets caught. We'll talk about that as we move forward. And this causes problems within his administration. And he appeals to the American people. And it's a big back and forth. Eventually brings about his downfall. But the Ho Chi Minh Trail was a supply line, as it said, almost 10,000 miles, 9,900 and some miles of trails, roads through other countries that the United States is not supposed to be able to attack to supply their forces. The Americans do attack those areas along with the South Vietnamese because their troops are getting killed and being supplied through these countries, so they figure it's fair game. They just don't tell people about it. So that's what the Ho Chi Minh Trail is. Hope that clarifies some things for you, and I'll be back with the Prezi in a second. So, we're picking up after the Ho Chi Minh Trail notes, and we've discussed the troop withdrawal and Vietnamization. You have protests going on in the United States, anti-war protests. People are not happy with us fighting. Showed you the map on one of the earlier videos. We're thousands of miles, basically the other side of the globe from where we live. People aren't happy with that. So November 3rd, 1969, President Nixon gives a speech where he brings up the term the silent majority. And he reaches out to many Americans and he says, basically, you look the speech up online, there's all kinds of videos, I'm not going to drop them in here. But he wants the silent majority, the people not protesting, the people who are quietly accepting what the government's doing and stand behind the government. They're just not out protesting and carrying on. Stand with him and do what's right for America, do what's patriotic. And this term silent majority has been something that occurs. You have the people who are always outspoken in society. And then they talk about the silent majority of people that don't go on discussion boards, don't go on Facebook and post their opinions. They say that those people, they're quiet, but they are the majority of the people, and it's their will that actually drives the country. So that was a major speech. It helped, let me put this, cause a divide, I want to say, between the protesters and the people that were supporting the government. And it continues to this day. Although protesters now have gotten, on both sides, have gotten more vocal about the issues. Now, issues with Cambodia and Laos. You have secret bombings. You have troops crossing the border in this effort to shut down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, combat insurgents in both countries. You have revolutions going on. It starts to look, in some people's eyes, like the domino theory is going to come about and actually be true. And the United States, even though we're drawing down troops, we're starting to bomb more. We're sending troops in South Vietnamese forces into other countries, which is outside of the scope of what the president said they were going to do. And this is going to cause issues. And we'll talk about some of the other things here in a second. But I'm going to get into the Nixon-Kissinger strategy in the Paris peace talks. I've read books from Kissinger, books from Nixon, and both of their books kind of sync up on this. I think I've talked about it when we were still in class, touched on some things. Kissinger would go into the peace accords and they have pre-planned, okay, we're going to attack on this day or we're going to bomb things on this day. And Kissinger would tell people, hey, he'd tell the North Vietnamese at the negotiating tables in Paris, we have to do something because I can't control Nixon. And it was pre-planned, like, okay, if there's nothing that's, no progress made, we're going to bomb these targets on this day. And they would bomb these targets. And they would kind of play good cop, bad cop, or good cop, crazy cop like you see in the movies. And that was to push the North Vietnamese to make concessions and sign a peace treaty. Well, Finally, January 1973, a treaty is reached. Both sides make concessions, and they come up with a solution that both sides are willing to accept. Although, after the treaty is signed, both sides continue to claim the other side is violating the treaty, either through bombings, through attacks, military excursions. So there's a treaty signed. All sides agree to it, but there's discrepancies as to how well it was followed. And we're going to leave off there for right now. Okay, after Nixon, after he resigns, there's a transition period, and we're going to get into that right now between Nixon and Ford. So this transition period, it starts with the Pentagon Papers. Pentagon Papers is a question you guys asked. Pardon the background noise, I'm outside, so you have dogs barking, you have gas trimmers going, but I'd rather be outside than inside today. Pentagon Papers. It was a study put forth by the Department of Defense to investigate and kind of document what was going on in Vietnam, U.S. support between 1945 to 1967. It took about a year or so to complete. So this was done. Covers from Truman through Johnson. And one of the people working on the Pentagon Papers was a man by the name of Daniel Ellsberg. He, as he read through the information, he became more and more anti-war, did not support the war. So he leaked, photocopied. There wasn't the computers like we have today. There wasn't email. So what he did was he photocopied the report. He leaked them in 1969 to members of Congress. Nothing really came of it. So 1971, he leaks documents, this time to the New York Times. And the New York Times tries to publish these papers, and this leads to a big blow up. Supreme Court cases, people, turning more against the war. Nixon comes out and tries to squash things. Goes to the silent majority, encourages those people to stay the course, but public opinion is starting to change. And basically what the Pentagon Papers say is the United States has lied about the amount of support they're giving to the South Vietnamese government. There was more money from Truman's days to the French to support and type of support and amount of money given to the South Vietnamese government through Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson. So they tried to discredit Ellsberg. They go through the Supreme Court. First Amendment Supreme Court case versus the New York Times government loses. Public opinion's being swayed. This is going into an election year, but Nixon, is putting out his front. He wins re-election handily. A break-in occurs in the effort to try and discredit Ellsberg. They break into his psychiatrist's office and try to get information on him, saying he's unstable, things of this nature. It's one of the first of the break-ins conducted by Nixon's White House staff. He dodges this one and walks away fairly unscathed, but public opinion is turning against him. Then, June 1972, June 17th actually, the Watergate Hotel and office complex. There's a break-in, another break-in, and the group is called the Plumbers. They're a White House group that broke into Ellsberg's psychiatrist, and they were doing the dirty work of the president. Nixon claims his innocence of knowing anything about the break-in. He wins re-election in a landslide. The court case keeps building, and people implicated, some of the people are his aides, they turn on the president and they testify. At that point, once they testify, word gets out about these secret tapes that and Nixon didn't install it. I believe Kennedy was the one who installed this recording system in the White House. So the special prosecutor is called, and he wants to hear the tapes. And Nixon doesn't want to give the tapes, so there is this back and forth fighting in the courts, refusal to turn tapes over to the special prosecutor investigating the president about the Watergate break-in and all this other information going on. October 1973, Vice President Agnew is tied up with some crimes from before he was vice president, when he was the governor of Maryland. Bribery, falsifying tax records, things of that nature, accepting kickbacks as a public official. October 1973, the Vice President, Spiro T. Agnew, resigns from the vice presidency. So after Vice President Spiro T. Agnew resigns, the man who was chosen to replace him is from the House of Representatives, a representative from Michigan by the name of Gerald R. Ford. This is important. This is going to play into things later. Ford is chosen by Richard Nixon. He is approved by the Senate, takes over as vice president. Gerald R. Ford has not been elected to the vice presidency. He was chosen. He was elected as a representative to the House of Representatives. That means he was elected by a group, a region in Michigan, to represent them. It wasn't even a statewide election. This will play into things as we move forward. So, Vice President Ford wasn't on the ticket when Nixon was reelected. And this is going to affect how he deals with things later on. So he becomes vice president. Then we have what's called the Saturday Night Massacre. Later, October 20th, 1973, Richard Nixon urges his Attorney General and the Justice Department to fire the special prosecutor who is investigating Nixon for the Watergate break-in and other issues. The Attorney General, the Assistant Attorney General, they refused to fire the special prosecutor. Said, that's not right. The Department of Justice Department is supposed to be independent of the president. They're supposed to be a watchdog, chosen by the president, but they're supposed to act outside of the presidency to watch, to make sure the president's following the laws. Nixon wants them to fire the special prosecutor. The Attorney General, Assistant Attorney General, both resign in protest. They refuse to fire the special prosecutor. Next person in line does fire the special prosecutor. Special prosecutor is let go, who's in charge of the Watergate investigation. The people go nuts. There's a huge outcry. Impeachment proceedings. People are, the representatives and senators are clamoring for public impeachment of the president. So a new prosecutor is brought in. Eventually, Nixon turns over the tapes. He's forced to. And they find these gaps, these blank gaps in tape. Growing up, I had access to cassette tapes. You guys don't have that. You have MP3 players. Basically, a cassette tape is a magnetic tape that records audio sounds, records audio. And there were these gaps, minutes-long gaps, that tapes were erased. And at first, people for the White House were saying, it was, probably hit a button. These have been there for a long time. Hit a button, accidentally erased information off the tapes. But then under study, they took a look at the tapes and they found that it wasn't like this, minutes-long gap. Wasn't just one gap where something went wrong on the tape, but they were intentional, many small erasures that are taking off bits and pieces of the tape. And this led to more public uproar and it was fairly certain that Nixon was going to be impeached. So he resigns, he steps down August 8th, 1974. Before he can be impeached, he's avoiding the impeachment process. Vice President Ford assumes the presidency. He steps up. He has not been elected to the office. He wasn't elected vice president. He was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives for a region of Michigan. He takes over. Within 6 weeks, he pardons President Nixon. He inherits Vietnam, post-Watergate world, and the mess that Nixon left behind. This is going to influence Ford in Vietnam and in other areas. This wraps up part 3 of the review. Ford and the miscellaneous questions will come with part 4. Thank you. This episode is written by us, you and me. They're your questions, my answers, thoroughly researched by several different sites as I go through and fact check from the books that I've read on Vietnam, the history books, and other websites I've used. So, hitting up different parts of research to get you the answers you are looking for.